Hey, good evening, everyone. This is Lori Charlton, Chair of the Board of Finance, and this is the organizational meeting of the Fund Balance Subcommittee of the Board. My Board of Finance colleagues, Craig Curley and Amy Ruggiero, are members of this subcommittee, as am I. I'll call the meeting to order and ask that we please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, we'll move to item 3, which is to hear, consider, and elect 2024-2025 officers. I'll make a motion to put this item on the floor. A second? Okay. And open up to members of the subcommittee for nominations. Mr. Curley?
Yeah, thank you, Lori. So we didn't get a chance to talk about it, but Amy, if you don't have any objections, I'd like to nominate, I'd like to move to nominate Lori as the chair, you as the vice chair, and I'll take the role of secretary.
That sounds great. Okay, I'll second that. You're good?
Yes.
Okay. All in favor? Aye. Okay, great. It's unanimous, 3-0. All right, thank you, everyone. So before we jump into the agenda, I want to acknowledge my other Board of Finance colleagues who are sitting in on the meeting. Jim Walsh, Jim Myers, welcome. And I see Mary LeClaire online. Just as background for the public, a good part of what's on our agenda tonight relates to issues surfaced during capital planning workshops the Board of Finance held during September, including capital projects for the Water Pollution Control Authority, or WPCA. So for any members of the public who aren't familiar with the WPCA, they are a separate entity within the town. They have separate taxing authority. And if you're hooked up to the sewer, they're the ones who send you your sewer bill. Since quite a bit of what we'll be discussing relates to the WPCA, we have John Marsilio, or had John Marsilio here, who is the director of DPW. And I think we may also be joined by Michelle Gore, who is the general manager for the WPCF. Our town attorney, Phil Piers, is here as well to help us understand any legal nuances that may impact the matters we'll be discussing. And of course, our first selectman, Bill Gerber, CFO, David Becker, and our budget director, Frank Manieri. So thank you, everyone, and welcome. So we can move to item 4, to hear, consider, and act upon a statement of short-term objectives for the Fund Balance Subcommittee. Motion to hear this item?
I'll make the motion.
Ms. Ruggiero, seconded by Mr. Curley. Okay, so the backup for this item was posted online on page 1. And I'll go through these items quickly. I'll take any comments or suggested changes from either the subcommittee members or my Board of Finance colleagues who are here are welcome to comment, and then we can vote on these objectives collectively. So the first 2 items are straightforward, which call for the committee to review the existing Board of Finance policies for fund balance and bonding and debt service. The current policies are also posted in the backup. And after a review, the subcommittee will determine whether or not to recommend any changes to those policies to the full Board of Finance for their consideration. Item 3 is to evaluate the town's recommendation for borrowing limits and debt service capacity within the existing debt service policy. The current policy is that the town's debt service, meaning the principal and interest we pay on loans that finance capital projects, is limited to 10% or less of annual budgeted expenditures for the town. And we are asking the town to make a recommendation for a lower percentage, under 10%, for planning purposes in the capital plan, to allow for plan level contingency in the event we have unexpected projects or we have urgent projects that come in at a higher cost than planned, so that we can be confident we won't exceed the 10% threshold, even if unexpected things happen. Item 4, for the committee is to evaluate how the town reflects the WPCA's debt within the debt waterfall and determine the appropriateness of including or excluding WPCA debt service from amounts included under that 10% policy limit. And that is, WPCA debt is debt that's paid for by the WPCA through its own revenue generation. And lastly, item 5, to recommend the town's recommended or evaluate the town's recommended methodology for financing WPCA projects between the town and the WPCA. In other words, should those projects be completely financed by the WPCA going forward and paid for by sewer users? And will they have the financial wherewithal to do that? Or should the projects be paid for by the town, or split based on some predetermined ratio, or split based on project type, or in some other manner? This issue is important because depending on how the costs are split, taxpayers who are not on the sewer system will be impacted differently. So those are the 5 items that constitute the proposed scope of what this committee will be responsible for. And then based on our work, we'll make appropriate recommendations to the full Board of Finance. So any comments from committee members or Board of Finance members? Mr. Walsh?
Madam Chairwoman, I have to say, one of the reasons I made sure I was here tonight, even though I wasn't supposed to be, is I'm concerned about 3, 4, and 5.
Okay.
They've never been part of the fund balance prerogative.
Right.
And the only way to add them on would be for the whole Board of Finance to vote to change the charge of the Fund Balance Committee. So I don't understand where we're going with the Fund Balance Committee, because the charge is pretty simple. It covers 1 and 2. It actually doesn't even cover bonding and debt service, to be honest with you. Because the charge of that, there was a whole nother committee in regards to setting up the policy for debt and what our debt policy was going to be. So I'm just kind of not understanding this, because this means that then any committee can add anything in the town to talk about to their committee charge without going back to the board. So I just don't think it's right, and I don't doubt that we need to have the WPCA stuff talked about either as a board, and I suggested at one of our last meetings, I think it was the capital planning meeting on WPCA, that we should get together as a board. I know you said we didn't have a lot of dates available at that point in time. If you need to have a board on that, I would gladly volunteer my services and would gladly chair that committee. But I just don't think it's a proper 3, 4, and 5 are clearly not proper to be put on this agenda or talked about, because it goes beyond the purview of what, at the very top, it's the Fund Balance Committee. So.
Okay. Does anybody have any, Mr. Curley, any thoughts?
Yeah, I certainly understand and respect the point that Mr. Walsh is making regarding making sure that the scope of the committee is limited. I guess my thought is that these are all very interrelated, but I certainly respect the history that Jim has on this board. I don't know if that means that the full board needs to expand the scope of this committee formally, or or if it's, maybe this is a question for our town attorney, but certainly I think all of this is relevant to the work that this subcommittee can do and ultimately bring back to the board for the full board to act on anyway. So it's a bit of a quandary.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and I understand your concern, Mr. Walsh. I think in one of our previous, might have been the capital planning workshop, we talked about the need to work on these issues. I think you might have made a suggestion that we have, a bunch of special meetings. I think we all concluded it'd probably be best done in a committee. I'm not aware that there's a formal charter for the Fund Balance Committee. Maybe I'm wrong. I've never seen anything like that. So from my perspective, I thought this committee, it's called the Fund Balance Committee. It's barely met in many years. We had a committee. We didn't have volunteers for any other committees other than the ones that are established. So for practical purposes, I thought we could agree to do this work. If we don't want to formally vote on this tonight, we can take it back to the board first, Board of Finance first, but I think somebody's got to do this work. I don't think there's an opportunity for the full Board of Finance to do it, given our other, given our schedule and everything else we have to work on. So, I don't know, Mr. Pierce, do you have any?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the charge for the subcommittee, if there is one.
I don't know.
Whether it.
Yeah, that's where I'm not.
Yeah, when we set it up, there was a charge of what the responsibilities was, just for like the debt service was. We needed a debt service policy. That was the charge for the debt service policy committee. So there was a committee set up for it. And, is every committee of the Board of Finance now able to take up whatever they want to do with anything with finances of the town of Fairfield? Like, even if it's not in your chart, even if it's not in the name, like, this is the fund balance committee, and now all of a sudden you wanna talk about WPCA debt limits? It makes no sense.
I've not seen the charge for this committee, so I don't
You wanna go do the research and get back to us, then get back to the whole Board of Finance?
Is there a charge?
We talked about why the committee was being formed.
When? No, I'm not challenging you, I'm asking.
2012, 2013, so we can go back to the minutes of the meeting.
So we have created ad hoc committees before. We had a purchasing policy committee.
Yeah.
I don't recall if we voted on that or not. I think we need a committee to do this work. I think we've got
Yeah.
volunteers. If somebody thinks it's inappropriate, I think we go through the rest of the agenda. We talk about these things, and if we feel it's necessary to have the Board of Finance formally agree to this rather than this committee, then I'm fine with that. But
Mary's been a long-term member of the committee. Mary, do you have any thoughts, or am I saying something inappropriate or wrong here?
No, can you hear me?
Yes, you can.
Okay. So Jim and I both served on the original fund balance committee together. And it was created from a need that we had, that was gonna take a little bit of work to find it, but it was a very specific purpose, and that was to research what we thought the level of the unfunded, what do you call it? The undesignated fund balance should be. And what percentage, and we went to other towns, the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities, and really researched throughout the country what fund balances should look like, what percentages,
yeah,
the
understood.
reasons for them. And so we came, and then we developed the policy that you sent to Amy and to the rest of your committee.
Okay.
And there's
Yeah,
been a lot of discussion over the years back and forth on what the percentages should be. And that was the critical piece to it, was to establish the percentage and how to manage that. And I guess future committees I always envisioned were really to discuss if we wanted to increase or decrease that percentage, if it was working for us or not.
Okay, and yeah, I think we should do that. So why don't we do this then? We can defer the vote on this, and at the Board of Finance meeting in November, we can change the name of the committee and vote on the objectives for this committee that are set forth here.
Madam Chair?
Yep, Mr. Curley?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you suggested that, because that's actually what I was thinking as well. Clearly, the scope of what we're talking about tonight is broader than the name of the committee suggests.
Right.
But as I mentioned, I do think that these are all interrelated and important. So if we change the name of the committee to be more reflective of the scope that we're considering, I think that makes a lot of sense. And obviously, there's an open invitation to anybody on the full Board of Finance to join the subcommittee. So if Jim or Mary or anybody else wants to participate, I think that would be great. And ultimately, it's going to go to the full board anyway. So,
Craig, I had specifically requested of Lori to be noticed for these meetings, and I wasn't, but Amy was kind enough to let me know when it was and to send me the information. But we should all receive that information if work is being done that's not being done at the full board, so everyone has the ability to attend or to listen to the meetings.
Okay. Well, Mary, I apologize. I did announce at the last meeting, so we did talk about this committee at the capital planning meeting. I did make an announcement at the last Board of Finance meeting that we would be meeting tonight. And I thought Jen Carpenter copied all the Board of Finance members. When I made the announcement last time, I did say that any Board of Finance member was invited to participate in the committee meeting as though they're a member of a committee. So if any of that got lost in translation, that's fine. But for purposes of moving on, why don't we just agree that we'll keep going? We don't have any other votes. Most of this is discussion tonight, so we can change the name of the committee formally and agree on our charge at the next Board of Finance meeting. Mr. Walsh?
And I will say, you did announce that the fund balance, so I appreciate you doing that. I was planning on maybe watching it live. I just did not know that this was gonna be the potential charge of what he was gonna be doing. But if we could also talk at the next Board of Finance, when we're talking about whether we should expand the powers or expand the scope of what the committee is going to be discussing.
Yeah, maybe this is not the fund, again, maybe we have
also have
Yeah.
a discussion of maybe the WPCA issue seems to me to be so large. Whether, at least as an option, we talk about whether we should have a WPCA committee separate and apart from the fund balance committee.
Okay, I'm happy to take that up. I think
Okay.
maybe just there is sort of a method to my madness here. So when we talk about timing and dates at the end,
Sure.
I think part of what we're going to need to grapple with is the fact that many of the things we're talking about here, we need to have some decisions made and work done before this board or the Board of Finance is asked to vote on capital projects. And usually we do that before the budget season starts. So we don't have a lot of time. So I'm not sure I have a warm feeling toward multiple different committees, but we can, again, formally change the name and the charge as people wish. And anybody, the invitation is open for anybody to participate. Okay, all right, yes.
Is it okay if I proceed?
Of course.
So just very quickly, I'm not really familiar with the way the committees work, because I'm first time actually, other than the short budget stuff, but if and I take it as value that the fund balance committee was established to establish that 10% rate, I mean, that's pretty straightforward as far as what the purpose would be to meet, and I think that we need to figure out all of to the extent of the debt and everything and the projects and the WPCA and all of that plays into what it's gonna all tie together. So to have a fund committee, if it's just for that purpose, doesn't seem to make that much sense. To me, it makes, I see this as the biggest issue, one of the biggest issues facing the board, aside from the budget.
Right.
So I think it makes sense to kind of combine them, would be my recommendation, especially since we have, lots of members that are interested in being part of it. I mean, so that would just be a recommendation.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Ruggiero. Yeah, I think part of the reason the Fund Balance Committee has, in my 5-year tenure on the board, I think it met 1 year and maybe one meeting. And I think the reason is that we have a pretty good policy on fund balance and nobody ever really felt the need to change it. So having a separate committee for that item, I would agree with you. We'd probably spend 10 minutes on it and then move on. So I think the bulk of what we're trying to work on are the issues that we agreed on at the last capital planning meeting, and we can go through the formalities. All right, so let's move to, so if it's okay with everyone, we'll just move to item 5. To hear and consider a presentation on the town of Fairfield's financial metrics, including a discussion of debt financing for WPCA projects. So the backup for this item was posted online supplementally. It is entitled Town of Fairfield Comparative Credit Analysis. It is a presentation that was previously provided to the Board of Finance, the full Board of Finance earlier this year. So I want to introduce Matt Spurndle from Phoenix Advisors. Mr. Spurndle advises the town on a variety of matters related to our bonding activity, and he leads the process of guiding the town through rating agency evaluations from Moody's and S&P and Fitch. Matt also presents to the full Board of Finance annually on the town's financial benchmarks. So for tonight, we asked Matt if he would take us through just an abbreviated analysis of the presentation of Fairfield's finances versus other AAA rated communities that he gave to the board earlier this year, and in particular for any helpful insight he could provide on how debt for other special purpose entities in Connecticut, like the WPCA, is handled and evaluated from a rating agency perspective. So Matt, welcome, and thanks for taking the time to be here.
Well, thanks, Lori, and thanks, everyone. Good to be here tonight. Like Lori said, we have the presentation from earlier this year. I think it was February. And again, really just very quickly, I know some of you in the room, I have seen this numerous times, so I don't want to, spend too much time on it and move things along quickly. But basically it looks at the primary metrics that the rating agencies look at when they're developing your credit and your rating outcome, things from the debt category, the financial category with fund balance. There's some wealth and income indicators, and some other indicators with respect to tax base and, economic activity and vibrancy. So, again, like I said, I'll just kind of walk through a couple of these quickly. Please feel free to stop if you have any questions. But basically, we took all the AAAs from Moody's in Connecticut, looked at those towns just graphically. Fairfield's in yellow, the rest of the towns are in blue. And to the extent that, from a credit strength perspective, it's kind of like pretty much the further right, the better in just about any of these. So I kind of try to do it that way. So you can kind of see very quickly where things fall. So, of course, the town is AAA with Moody's, S&P, and Fitch, and has been for many, many years. We were, had a negative outlook, I believe, in like 2004, was, for some low fund balance reasons and some other things that were going on at the time. But very strong since, and looking very stable in the eyes of the credit rating agencies. So we're just flipping through here. You have the listing of the towns on the first page. Then we jump into total fund balance as a percentage of revenues, and you can see kind of where things fall out. The AAA median's about almost 17%. Fairfield's at maybe whatever it is, 12.5% there. So you can kind of see, relatively speaking, it's on the lower side, and something that always kind of comes up in the conversation, just from the perspective that they would make sure it stays there and doesn't, go down, because obviously that would be more of a concern. Whenever we're the bottom or the closest to the bottom on some of these metrics, we do get a little concerned. Not at this point, but they have mentioned it, that if there were, financial reserve deterioration over time, then that could put pressure on the rating. You all have a lot of other variables and components and things that sort of drive tax rates and reserve levels, but just, strictly from a credit rating perspective, that's where we're coming from here. I'll just tell you that that's, one of the things that they're looking at. So you got a total there. Unassigned is the next page. You're one, just as it turns out, you're one notch higher in this one, with the Connecticut median at 14%, and we're at about 10.5 plus or minus. From one year to the next, it's going to vary, to an extent, but not too much. So you can see that there. I don't know if you have any questions. It's pretty straightforward. We can just sort of someone, I don't know, is there a question?
Matt, when will these be able to be updated? I mean, I see that these are based on August 23 release dates by the state of Connecticut OPM. Are the 24s numbers out yet?
The last time I went on their site, they weren't, because they're just slow. I mean, we used to get these things in like February, and then now it's like the end of the year. So the data is kind of slow to come out from the state. I'll check, and then sure, we could update it. But
I appreciate it.
I will say, from one year to the next, unless somebody does something really, significant, the numbers are going to all kind of fall out around the same. Maybe, not necessarily with, fund balance, if someone decided to fund a $20 million project and use fund balance, well, that's going to be significant. But as we move down through some of these other charts, of course, like debt burden to grand list and net debt per capita from one year to the next are really not changing too significantly from one year to the next.
Just one other question is, do the credit agencies look at total fund balances percentage of revenues more than they look at the unassigned general fund balance, or
it's impossible for me to tell you which one they look at more closely, but I would say that unassigned is, that's the freer cash availability for flexibility's sake. So that one, tends to get looked at, maybe a little bit more than the total.
Great. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So
Thank
then
you.
again,
Matt,
go ahead.
Matt, sorry, do you mind if I know you're flipping through in order. I think, at least from my perspective, it'd be helpful to focus on some of these debt burden slides. The reason being is that part of the reason we're meeting here is we have, we were presented with a capital plan that has substantially larger numbers and will lead to substantially higher borrowing over time, annually and over time if it goes forward. So, can you just qualitatively, as you go through this, I mean, we can obviously see the benchmarks and see where we stand in relation to the other communities, but can you just give us your perspective as part of that discussion, if there's anything, to be concerned about, or, when red flags might arise in something like this?
Sure. No, 100%. And again, not to go chronologically with this presentation, but, you could just see the next couple with debt burden of net debt to equalize grand list, and then net debt per capita, debt service to budget, the following page. There's really nothing. I mean, obviously, when we talk about debt in the town of Fairfield, as you can see by the charts, we tend to be in the higher third, from the metrics perspective. When you talk about debt service to the budget, it's really right in the middle, at like 6%, if you look at that. So there's really, just from taking a step back overall, and again, a lot of this isn't just my perspective. This is coming from the rating agencies that we've talked to dozens of times over the years, and just trying to kind of relate those comments and in things that have been in their reports. And I'll be honest with you, there's really nothing from the debt side of things that has the rating agencies overly concerned at this moment, nor am I concerned. Now, that being said, if the town were to go out and do $50-60 million a year for the next 10 years, obviously that's going to push up a lot of these numbers. We've looked at the waterfall chart, obviously, so many times, and it does push up to north of 8.5, 9, close to 10% potentially. Those are levels that would give rating agencies some concern. But again, not necessarily like just that in a vacuum. It would be also, again, along with the other criteria that are important to the rating, which, like we talked about, fund balance, income, wealth, housing values, et cetera, et cetera. So in the event that the debt does continue to drift to be among the higher in the category, if there is deterioration elsewhere, then we can have a situation where the credit could be, in jeopardy potentially. I don't see that happening anytime soon unless something is going on that I don't know about. And really, from one year to the next, we can do a bond issue for 30 million. We could do it for 50 million. It's not going to make a huge difference from the rating agency's perspective. It might make a difference from the town's perspective because of the tax impact and all those types of things that are very important to your constituency and to the taxpayers. But from our perspective, really from one year to the next, it's more how the budget's managed, how those reserve levels look, because that's something that can change from year over year. And to the extent that, for instance, if those levels deteriorate or are drawn down and create a gap deficit in your audit report, that those couple of things kind of get dinged against you when you talk to the rating agencies, like, oh, okay, they had a drawdown, so then that's considered a deficit. And, now their fund balance is lower. What's the trend? And then that starts to cause a whole nother conversation. So, we can look at the charts. They're very straightforward. You're pretty much right in the mix everywhere you look. Maybe with the debt being a little bit on the higher side, the fund balance being a little bit on the lower side. But all the calls we've had in the last 5 years, however many years, we really haven't had any major concerns, any major any calls that really would lead us to believe like, wow, we're like borderline AAA and we better watch out. Now that being said, when a rating agency, and it happens more than it has ever happened over the last since pretty much 2008, it seems like every couple of years a rating agency tweaks a criteria. You know what I mean? Like Fitch just tweaked their criteria to put more emphasis on like population growth and a couple other things. S&P did the same thing. It impacted school districts a little bit more than towns. And Moody's has done it. S&P has done it. They've done it so many times. In the event that one of those agencies do adjust the criteria in the future, and for whatever reason, the town of Fairfield, it doesn't like benefit the town of Fairfield, well, then that would be my biggest concern, rather than just the town of Fairfield like running themselves into their own problems with respect to the credit.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I that's helpful. I think if I were to sum it up, you're saying that if the debt continues to drift up over the next 10 years, as we are projecting it to do based on our capital plan, that is not, based on the current criteria, that's not necessarily going to be an issue unless there are other negative factors within our other benchmarks. Potentially, it could raise questions if the criteria are changed. Is that a fair summary?
I think that's an excellent summary, yes.
All right. So and I think, again, I didn't want to spend too much time on, some of these other measures here are not necessarily relevant to what the committee is going to consider. Do you mind, if it's okay with everyone else, do you mind maybe shifting and talking to us a little bit about debt for special purpose entities, like the WPCA, and how we should be thinking? I'm sorry, Mr. Curley, did you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Before we move off of that onto the next piece, I just did have one question for Matt. You talked about our, on one of your charts, you talk about how our debt service to operating expenses is currently a little over 6%. I understand all the qualifications that you put on it in terms of, there's no one factor that the rating agencies look at. But I guess my question to you is, when we looked at our potential capital spend a few meetings ago, we saw that we were approaching that 10% limit that we have as our policy, but we were approaching it in 2031. So we're 6-7 years out. How far out are the rating agencies looking, and are we being too conservative if we're looking at a capital and bond forecast that far out as we're trying to think about approving projects today?
No, I think that's a very good question. And I will say, first, taking a step back, the way the town goes about managing and forecasting for the capital needs is about as thorough and comprehensive as any town that we work with. And that covers about 85 towns in Connecticut. So from that perspective, it is viewed very positively from the rating agencies because of that fact that you're really forecasting, you're really planning, and that obviously reflects well on management, et cetera. But really, what the rating agencies tend not to react to, those types of things until they've happened.
Okay.
So, it's not as if, oh gosh, in 31 things are going to be rough. Like, let's downgrade it, in 28. Like because so many things can change, and they understand that there's so many different factors. So it really kind of more happens once those things flow through to the audited financial statements.
Got it. That's helpful. Don't need to go any further. Thank you.
Okay. All right, yeah, thank you, Mr. Curley. Yeah, that is a good question, but I think part of what we're, obviously what the board thinks about is not just the rating agencies, but the management of the town's finances and the effect that this will have on taxpayers over time. And though some of these things might take years to ratchet up toward that 10%, once we approve these projects and we issue bonds, we can't take them back. So we are, locking into things that are going to impact us in the future. All right, so if there aren't any other questions, Matt, would you pivot to special purpose entities or whatever you want to call them, and talk to us a little bit about how, what should we be thinking about in terms of that topic and the WPCA potentially, based on their project list, being responsible for substantially more debt that's really issued under the town's, full faith and credit, but is paid for by them. Maybe help us understand what we should be thinking about.
Sure, and I can definitely appreciate this topic. I mean, we've talked about it a little bit, obviously, before, but not to the extent that, for Fairfield, you really haven't had to deal with it necessarily to this point or to the point of the next, decade or so, because the numbers just weren't that big. The sewers, the WPCA kind of was able to, and has been able to, pay the debt service that they've issued, et cetera. But so the way the rating agencies look at this is, we obviously look at your total debt. They obviously look at your total debt, what's called overall net debt. So they'll look at overall net debt per capita, the grand list, et cetera. And, those metrics will fall where they fall. But they also look at something called, that would be the total long-term debt. The overall net debt piece is the piece that then backs out, if you're getting state grants, or what have you for certain things, or if you have a self-supporting entity like a WPCA or electric division or a water usage kind of a thing. So it sort of it removes that self-supporting debt from sort of the bottom line. Now, that's not to say that debt, that they ignore that debt completely, because it is still obviously being paid by your taxpayers, but just based on their usage. So it does go into the equation. But when you look at, when they get to the real important ratios, they tend to back out the self-supporting. So, from the perspective of the town, or any issuer, when we talk with the rating agencies, it's important to be able to not only say, yes, this portion of the debt is self-supporting, but it's also important to prove that, and how do you prove that? Well, you prove that it flows through your audit reports, or you have, various agreements, MOUs, what have you, with the entity, and you can show that that entity is in fact able to support that debt service, and that you're not just saying it, but it really, isn't happening in real life. So it's not a super extensive part of the conversation, but to the extent that we could, tell them, that it is a self-supporting entity, and B, if there's any supporting documentation that they might, ask for, to be able to provide it for them. Again, not super extensive. I think, the documentation that you might put together is probably more important from an internal perspective, but could definitely help when we're talking with them, so we can show what's happening there. Because as we can see, with some of these numbers over the course of time, there looks like there'll be a shift from, who's paying the debt service on the WPCA because of the numbers, and it just won't be able to sustain it. But the projects, may need to be done. So, that's pretty common for all rating agencies, all issuers. The self-supporting piece is a particularly important, especially as the numbers get bigger. And again, it's not to say, well, it's not as if it's a deteriorating factor or something really negative if the entity can't support it. But, to the extent that we could, show them where things are, even if it's a percentage, maybe they're supporting half of the debt, or, they could take half the debt out to get to your bottom line net number. So that is important to note, and it's important to have that, information readily available for them too.
Okay. Thank you. I want to see if anyone has any questions, but so the concept of net debt, as it would be considered by a rating agency, would exclude debt that the self-supporting entity is paying for. We have to be able to demonstrate that they could pay for that. We have an MOU that says they agree to do that, and presumably they have the financial means, to pay that debt service without becoming insolvent over time, right?
Correct.
Okay,
That makes good sense to me.
okay, Mr. Anybody questions on that, or board members? Mr. Curley?
Yeah, I just want to make sure I heard all of that correctly. So clearly an MOU is important. I don't think we have one right now. So
We do.
So, well, to the extent that we're splitting the debt service on future projects, or the bonding on the debt on future projects. But I imagine that to the extent that the WPCA becomes illiquid and not self-sustaining, would that then cause the WPCA debt to collapse into our calculations at the town level?
Well, yeah, exactly that. I mean, if it gets to a point where the WPCA can't support it, then it just becomes town debt at that point. Now, if there's like an identifiable, portion or a percentage, that'll obviously all be incorporated into the rating. But yeah, to the extent that if they can't make the payments or they're not able to support it, then whatever the town is paying, that would have to then get included into your.
Well, but let me make my point more clear. I think everyone recognizes if the town doesn't take some action with respect to the WPCA projects that are in front of us, the WPCA will not be able to support itself. So the town's going to proactively step in at some point. We're going to have an MOU that makes it clear that the town's going to carry this much, leave the WPCA with that much. But whatever work we do as a board, we're going to have to determine what level of debt the WPCA can support prospectively, and maybe that's half, maybe that's 40%, who knows what the number is, but whatever level we decide, it's got to make sure that the WPCA can continue to support itself at that level to avoid having the WPCA debt collapse back onto the town's levels.
Right.
That's the point that I was making.
Yeah, Mr. Curley, do you mind if I just jump in on, because you're right, and I think the intent on the agenda was to get into that a little bit later in terms of talking about next steps. So not to jump ahead, but in item 8, there's something in there called WPCA financial planning. I think that gets to exactly what you're talking about. So, we don't want to blindly, make a policy that or vote on project by project MOUs without understanding what that's going to do to the WPCA's balance sheet over time. So, I think the thing that the board has talked about over time, it's never happened, but it needs to happen now, is that a long-term financial plan is developed. It has a set of assumptions in it on which no one's bound by, but rate increases, basically a long-term P&L so that the amount of debt service that's sustainable by the WPCA under that type of plan is evident. And then that's an input to the capital plan. It has to be an input to the capital plan because that capital plan and the waterfall gets to measure how much the town's going to pick up and how much the town taxpayers are going to be affected. So yes, you're absolutely right. And I think that's why some of this is iterative. That financial planning piece, that's why we've got Frank here, because that's going to be his new job, I think. And we're going to have to grapple with what that looks like and what the requirements are. So absolutely. Questions from board members or no? Okay. Anything else, Matt, on this topic?
Nothing that I can think of, unless there's anything that you all have or have a question about. I think we covered it pretty good.
Mr. Walsh?
Matt, on the last 2 sheets, there's bonded debt, pension, and OPEB liability per capita. Clearly, we're on the higher side as a town. And most, we're at the, I guess, bottom third on that, correct?
Correct.
Is this any cause of concern
Well, I mean, that kind of goes in hand with the debt numbers that we were looking at earlier. Like your debt's on the higher side, so you naturally kind of are going to be on the higher side when, you know, I mean, potentially when you layer in the pension and the OPEB. So that's the long-term liability. They're all sort of related. So I wouldn't say that there's any major concern there. Interestingly enough, I mean, you're at like for instance, the last page, you're at like 2%, under 2%. The other two are a little bit over, you know, one's over 3%. We're at high 2s. You know, the difference between, you know, 1.5% and 2% in these kind of metrics aren't really that significant when it comes to the needle moving on the rating. So I'm not, you know, all that concerned with those charts. And the main driver there is the debt. So that's kind of what we've been talking about and focused on. So
Okay, so even though it's 25% more than the median, it's not that big a deal.
I mean, that's from the perspective that I'm concerned that it's going to change the rating at this point.
Okay, because these numbers are only gonna get worse with the debt we're talking about adding on.
That's true.
I mean, it's gonna get much worse.
Well, and then we have the OPEB and the pensions, depending on how that changes over time. So there's a lot of factors that go into these couple of charts. You know, it just tries to give a bigger picture of all the liabilities.
Okay. 'Cause I think these numbers are like the rosiest picture I see of them from the 23. These numbers are just gonna be deteriorating. And we could be moving categories on towns, switching positions. All right. Millions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Walsh. Any other questions for Matt Spurndle before we let him go? All right, Matt, thank you as always. Thank you for everything you do for the town. We appreciate you being here tonight. And if we have any questions, we will be in touch.
All right. Thank you very much. Have a good night, everyone.
Thanks, Matt.
All right.
All right, we can move to item 6, to hear and consider background and relevant matters related to the WPCA statutory and town charter authority for long-term financial planning and borrowing. So the backup for this item is also posted online, and it's just the relevant charter and state statute provisions related to the WPCA. And we just thought it would be helpful to have town attorney peers, just I think for everyone's education and background, make sure we all understood the structure of the WPCA, anything that might be relevant in terms of long-term financial planning or the WPCA taking on debt obligations or responsibilities of the commissioners or limitations of the commissioners in terms of committing to long-term financial plans, et cetera. So Phil?
Sure, so the existence of the WPCA is authorized by statute. It has independent statutory authority that's in that statute to enter into contracts, obviously assess taxes, do those sorts of things through or assess charges. Ours is established through our charter. It has the independent authority set forth in the charter to maintain the system, do all the things it needs to do to accomplish that. It can hire employees. In practice, our WPCA has not really functioned that independently. It's kind of been run as a department of the town historically in Fairfield. So in terms of what the authority of the WPCA is versus how it's been handled in practice, it's kind of been run a little bit differently. And I think that in part that's because of a concern about the cost on the WPCA if it were to have more internal or actually internal personnel. So in terms of its authority, I mean, it can certainly enter into agreements. It has entered into MOUs. It has independent authority to do that. In terms of how to proceed for bonding, the issue is that the capital plan that the Board of Finance promulgates is not, while it's an important document, it's not binding until you actually vote on the bonding resolutions themselves. So, if you had a capital plan that was voted on by both the Board of Finance and the WPCA, that's probably a good idea to the extent the projects relate to WPCA affairs, but wouldn't necessarily be binding on either entity. We could consider some sort of MOU to define the cost share for bonding and capital projects between the two. But, until the funds are actually appropriated, or there's commitment, at the time we go to bond, there may still be some uncertainty at that point about, the extent to which the WPCA can commit, and obviously they're, they're making that decision now based on expectations in the future about their financial condition in the future, so there may not be a guarantee from the town's perspective on how much we can expect the WPCA to contribute, so. Or how much we would insist the WPCA contribute.
So, and this, Mr. Curley sort of alluded to this before, but so we have MOUs on a project by project basis, right? So the WPCA has a project, the town issues debt, project by project, an MOU is signed that the WPCA will be responsible for the debt service on that bond. But I just was picking up on something you said. So there could be an MOU that the commissioners could enter, or an agreement that the commissioners could enter into an MOU, which basically solidifies a policy for how debt is split.
I think so, yeah, I think that the two could agree on how debt is split going forward, but obviously, Mr. Curley mentioned, it would be subject to some limitation because we have to establish that there has to be an understanding of what's an acceptable threshold of debt for the.
Right, no, I understand, but let me just get a complete hypothetical, so I don't want anybody to get mad at me or any taxpayer to freak out or anything, but let's just say that the committee and the Board of Finance and the town recommended, and we all agreed that the WPCA should be responsible for any projects relating to existing infrastructure, repairs, I&I, pump stations, all those good things. And anything related to expansion of pipes or, new sewer lines or whatever would be the responsibility, or would be split with the town, and the facility, the treatment facility would be paid for by the town. So we came up with some policy around that had a rational split of costs. It would be I think that, and Jim, you can help me out here. I think that this has sort of been handled on an ad hoc basis in the past, and I think there's been a desire, right? Because we're setting precedent to have a policy, but we could go beyond a policy theoretically, and there could be an actual agreement supported by, we'd have to have the financial plan to support that and make sure it all makes sense. But that could actually be formalized with an agreement if there was a desire to do that.
I think it could,
And the reason I'm asking is that, commissions change over time, right? So could an agreement entered into by a group of commissioners, bind the WPCA going forward on a long-term basis if they were to do that in terms of cost share?
I think it could. I think that how effective that agreement is, I think is going to be determined by the details and
right. Okay.
how this financial plan is intended to work. And I mean, the other thing is that if the WPCA disagrees that the project is necessary or whether something is expansion or not expansion, then the town is in, unless the town's arm in arm with the WPCA on all these projects, you're gonna end up with a disagreement between the two, and ultimately you'll be left with not a lot of good options other than litigation with the WPCA.
Yeah, no. And I'm not even thinking of a legal dispute. I'm just more thinking of memorialize something other than in a policy which sits in a drawer and people don't forget where it is, or, we don't have a great history with that. I mean, an agreement is, to me, just has more to it in terms of, from a precedent perspective, and, we'd probably have to be more thoughtful, and it survives, just like our fund balance policy and our debt policy, it survives, changes in the composition of our elected bodies, and that's why I'm asking.
It would be more definite and provide a clearer framework for these projects, for sure.
Interesting. Mr. Gerber?
But I believe annually the WPCA has to approve the plan, right? Isn't that a statutory requirement
Has to approve.
their capital plan, their.
Well, they would have to, right, so they would have, I mean, they have to, just because they agree to this MOU, they still have to ultimately, if there's a project being done, they have to.
They have to approve it.
authorize the project.
Yeah.
So if they didn't do that,
Then,
that's what was my point before, is that it
Right.
would be, it could be considered a violation of the MOU. So the problem is that we'd have to have, the MOU is not really the endpoint for the discussions. It establishes maybe a framework, but the town and the WPC have to remain arm in arm.
Yeah.
In these.
I was just more thinking of it as a more robust policy, I guess, versus something that we're
So-
going to fight over legally.
Every time.
No, but I think
Yeah.
it is a more, something that's more definite than just a policy or the capital plan.
Ms. Ruggiero?
Yeah, wouldn't, if we had something like that, it would give us a framework, and then when you're doing the forecasting, you'd be able to say and be able to tell which projects are gonna be bared by the town, by the WPCA, shared by both. You would also be able to determine based on the need when you're looking at it, because the fact that it has to still come for approval, I don't think changes anything, because all of our stuff comes for approval for all the boards. So I think that it would still be very valuable to have. And then you could use that also to determine what the fee structure needs to look like when you're looking at all those projects. Because ultimately, we're gonna end up back at the fee structure and how the WPCA is gonna be able to, or if it is gonna be able to fund this, these potential projects, which is gonna come back to us again. If they're not, how do we balance that? And to the extent it goes on the town's books, then it's gonna impact what we just talked about with the, our
Ratios, yeah.
our ratios and our percentages that we have.
Madam Chair.
Sure, Mr. Curley?
Yeah, so this is, I think, a question for Mr. Pierce. It may already exist in the WPCA's charter, but does it behoove us to memorialize in a MOU that the WPCA would ensure through their rate base that debt service is covered at the WPCA level? Like, point being, if we agree to split a project 50-50, and that's part of our MOU, based on whatever rationale we come up with, there is a consequence to the town if the WPCA isn't raising revenue on their taxpayers, their tax base, to cover that debt service that they're obligated to, because otherwise it falls back on us. So it may be already explicit in their charter, but I wonder if it should also be explicit in our whatever MOU we enter into.
Right, I think it would have to be explicit in the MOU because, they're required to fund their own operations, but the way it's been done in practice is the town bonds the money and enters into an MOU with the WPCA for, in relation to that bond, right? That's how it happens in
Right.
practice.
Right, and it may be belts and suspenders, but better safe than sorry, right?
Well, and the Board of Finance, obviously, and I've been Board of Selectmen as well, vote on the WPCA budget. So if the budget were not covering, so we know what the debt service is, because that's included in that budget based on the previous MOUs. And so they would have to present and we would vote on a budget that,
Yeah.
covers that. Understanding the rates are set later, kind of after the budget process. We're really voting on the expenses and the commissioners have that when they set rates and vote on revenues. But they're doing that just like we set a mill rate based on the budget. The commissioners are setting rates. So I hear what you're saying. I think I guess it's a question of how it works on a long-term basis versus year by year. Yeah.
The reason I bring up the point, Madam Chair, is because what we heard at our last meeting was that for years, the WPCA was budgeting for I&I expense and not spending it. And then they were building up a reserve, so all the bodies felt like the WPCA was actually in pretty good shape because had all these dollars and they were reflecting a lower rate to their taxpayers because they weren't spending this money and then building up this reserve. But in reality, they were just deferring maintenance, and now we've got a bigger problem because I&I is a really big issue right now. So I think it's just really important to make sure that we memorialize the responsibility of the WPCA commissioners, especially in this context because of the consequences to the town. But moreover, just making sure that they understand that they need to be taxing their taxpayers or ratepayers accordingly.
Thank you, Mr. Crowley. Mr. Walsh, did you have a?
Yeah, Madam Chairwoman, I kind of agree with you about it, some type of policy about. It would be, you know, maybe the town would be responsible for like the treatment center and because it benefits the whole town, including the commercial base. And also an expansion of a system. For example, correct me if I'm wrong, Bucky, but I think it's the east trunk line that goes towards Commerce Drive. So the east trunk line. We're expanding that, we're making it larger. And one of the reasons we're making it larger is to support additional tax base in regards to all the apartments that have been built around there in order to support what's gonna happen at the Commerce. I can't remember the name of it, it's been so long.
Fairfield BlackRock.
BlackRock, I don't know even what it's called now, so whatever it's called over there, to support that project, whether it be housing, commercial, whatever it's going to be. One of the reasons we need to do the expansion. Well, on those projects, the town is getting all the tax dollars from that. And therefore, I think it makes sense that you can argue that, yes, the town should pay for that expansion. Because
Or some of it,
or some of it.
Yeah.
I still believe that WPCA should be funding repairs. And it's only in recent years where they started increasing the amount of money they raise for repairs to a pretty dramatic way to go, because they see what's coming down the pike. For too many years, we've relied on the WPCA to be this committee and to monitor the system. And no one raised an issue that we had these problems with deferred maintenance. Well, I think we need to get in a memorandum, and one of the reasons I think about when you were talking about it is, at least we have something to say to the taxpayers when they say, well, I have septic system. Why am I paying for that? Well, there's a reason, because the policy will spell out the reason, because it's the expansion of the system, we're getting taxed on it. It's the treatment center pays for everything. Whereas the other side is maintenance of the system should be paid by the users. I totally get that. So I guess in listening to it, I would kind of like to have further discussion, more detailed discussion, but some type of memorandum of understanding. As long as we can look at it and have some type of financial plan to see if that thing works. It works, because I don't want to get into a system. Okay, this is the policy. But, oh, by the way, it doesn't work either, and town's still gonna have to jump in and pay X number of dollars, so.
I mean, based on what the preliminary sketch that Mr. Becker did in the financial plan, I don't. It might by accident work out just fine. It seems like, you know, when you look at there is an amount in the capital plan for the treatment facility, there's a bunch of money for pump stations and force mains and I&I and all this stuff. And so there's I'm not saying that the split right now is exactly right, or that it's certainly not based on a project by project basis. It was sort of front loaded into the WPCA and then back loaded on the town. But you're right, you know, and maybe that'll be one of the charges for our newly named committee. But I think having a policy is important. You know, we sort of on an ad hoc basis will approve this 50-50 split on the East Trunk Line. And I think that was the right thing to do. But it was an ad hoc decision, you know, and it wasn't really attached to anything. So I think having an MOU that, you know, formalizes the policy, the thought process behind it, you know, this is why it's being done this way. This is why it's fair to taxpayers in this way. I very much agree with that. I don't know, Mary, if you have any.
I like the idea of a policy and detailing like what's maintenance and repairs versus new expansion. I think that makes a lot of sense. And so, but I still think this is so important that it really needs to come to the full board and be discussed there as well.
No, absolutely. And all of this, whatever this committee is, the only action it can take is to agree on recommendations to the full board of finance. So, we don't, that's all of this, but it's just, a group of us who are willing to attend a bunch of extra meetings and do a bunch of the legwork, because we cannot fit all of these activities in our normal agendas over the next few months. So absolutely, 100%. Any other thoughts on this? Oh, Mr. Giro.
Other than this specific project that was gonna be split 50-50, have all projects that have come before us, when I was on RTM, et cetera, they were WPCA specifically. So now we're talking, that gets into the bigger conversation of possibly changing the structure where we're looking at either one way or the other, where somebody not on a septic would either get an increase in their taxes or a separate bill to contribute something towards funding the WPCA.
I think it would end up as an increase, it would end up being part of the overall mill rate for.
So it wouldn't be like.
Yeah, can I ask Mr. Marsilio though, I'm not aware, so the projects that have been approved in recent years, I think those all kind of fell in the category, other than East Trunk Line, right? Did they all, am I correct in recalling that they all sort of fell into the category of kind of repairs?
Yes.
Okay.
Or improvements.
And they were all funded by the WPCA?
Yes, as a matter of fact, in your discussions this evening about an MOU, every bond resolution
Yeah.
has to get approved by the commission, and the bond resolution dictates that the WPCA will honor that debt service. So if you want, as Mr. Curley spoke about belt and suspenders, that's fine. But I think at this point, you're covered.
Yeah, that was for past ones. I think the MOU we're talking about is future policy. Yeah, okay, but I hear you.
But this MOU would not lock in the WPCA to setting future rates. I think.
No. Just to say that there's a
approach in terms of.
common agreement. Here's what's called maintenance. Here's categories that are paid for by rate holder sewer users. This is a category that benefits the whole town. This is what's included in each one. And I think the intent on the agenda was that at some point to get a recommendation for a policy around that. I think this whole MOU thing is just an extension of having a policy, that's all.
Just one more question. Does anyone know what is the percentage of households in the town of Fairfield that are on the WPCA versus septic?
About 2/3.
So 2/3 are on the sewer?
Yes.
2/3, and
That's of households.
And that
not on
includes-
tax base, right?
and also our universities.
The commercial.
Yeah.
Yes.
All commercial downtown. I know that's
All
all, and the
commercial.
2 universities are on the sewer.
Yeah.
And the service center too, the 95 service center.
Okay, yeah, because we do have non-taxpaying entities like the universities who
Yes, they
pay
benefit for
sewer
it.
bills.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Oh, they get, yes, I
They
knew
get-
that.
they
They get,
pay.
they pay, they don't pay
Yeah.
tax, but they pay for the sewer.
yeah, because they're on the sewer. So to the extent these costs go into the WPCA and they're appropriate to go in, they, again, 2 distinct sets of taxpayers, yeah.
Well, that's where it's advantage to make sure the WPCA gets the charge.
Yes.
But the other half of that, I mean, we talk a lot about expenses here in debt service. And they're kind of easy to quantify once you have a project and the cost of the project and the length and the life of the project. And it's very hard to quantify the revenue side of what it means to the grand list and how those ratepayers benefit from it. So, that's there. It's both part of the whole equation. The rates are gonna rise to address the need to address the debt service. By the same token, the town's gonna benefit by an increase in the grant list. So it's but we don't know what that's gonna be. We know for sure what the debt service is gonna be, because we know what the projects are gonna cost.
That just makes me think of something else. So to my point, when I asked about households, so this is 2/3 of the households, but we need to look at the tax base and say, of those 1/3 that aren't on the sewer, what is the amount they're paying in taxes, real estate taxes versus the whole bill? And I'd be curious, like, if it's not just that 1/3, because if it's the town paying it, the mill rate's going up, the people that are on the sewer are getting a sewer bill plus the impact of the increase in the mill rate, they're getting essentially double taxed. Right?
They also, I mean, they get the service though.
Yeah,
so-
they get.
Well, they get the service and they get the benefit of the downtown, which is the logic to the people that are on the
Right.
septic.
Yeah. Yes, I wouldn't, yeah,
I know this is
you're right.
very detailed and it's
Well,
probably.
No, you're right, I just, when the
Well, I'm
idea of being double take, I think Phil's point, right, you get the benefit of being on the sewer system and you're paying for that. And then you're paying a portion of the broader cost of these projects that benefit the town as a whole.
Which I totally understand, because, for example, I'm not on the sewer. It's not even an option for me to be on the sewer. I don't wanna pay,
Mhm.
just throwing that out
Of
there.
course.
I mean, no one does, but if I'm going to have to pay, because it's the logic of the downtown area. And, you know, the benefits that we get as a town, because we see how other towns that don't have a robust downtown get affected and their property tax is just a lot higher. That logic would then stick for someone else that does have the sewer, they're getting the service of not having to maintain a septic. And all the things that go into that and to pay for that, as well as the downtown area. So I'm just trying to understand, it's not a double tax per se, it's the logic that I still have to absorb and get comfortable with that going up, I guess is what I'm saying.
Mr. Gerber.
I think this is really complicated and we need to probably put a lot of effort. I'm not even sure, I don't know if anyone actually like can help us with this, because I feel like we should get it right. We should get this split really right. If there's a way to measure benefit to non sewer users, maybe we can come up with a formula that makes sense for everybody, because because we also, you know, for a new development like at Fairfield Blackrock, so obviously new sewer users, you know, will benefit the existing base as well. You're spreading it over more people, but the whole town gets some benefit as well. I'm not sure I'm equipped, you know, to do this calculation, and maybe there is somebody who is. So we should probably look around for some help, because I'm sure that other towns, you know, face this. So hopefully there's something to look at.
Yeah, so to your point, I mean, unless you did it by, like, on a project by project basis, like, let's just say you had, I mean, what we did with the East Trunk, 50-50.
Well, that was very scientific.
Yeah, I mean, should that have been 60-40 or so, like, and that's.
Well, I'm just looking at New Haven, they just do everything 40-60, you know,
Oh, really? Okay,
town authority, yeah.
Yeah,
But
so, okay,
there's no magic, well, there may be a calculation behind it, so.
okay.
I agree with that. We definitely need to have some kind of understanding, because it's gonna be a pill to swallow either way.
Well, and the thing is, we will
need to
be
able to
voting,
explain it.
we will be voting on these projects in the near term, A.
Yeah.
And B, this calculation impacts all these debt calculations in the waterfall that we're all talking about and are trying to get comfortable with. And that's kind of the urgency of addressing it, for planning purposes. So,
We certainly can't put it off much longer.
Yeah.
Some of these projects we've been putting off, and it's getting to a point where, God forbid, we have a crisis. I know we don't wanna plan for that, but it could be a lot more cost.
yeah, no, and from a financial perspective, again, I keep thinking we need to get an updated capital plan before we start voting in February on most of these items. And
Absolutely.
this is one of those things that impacts it, so. And it will also impact the WPCA's budget process and all that good stuff, and the long-term financial plan that we'll talk about later.
But can I just add one thing?
Yeah.
What John said, Marsilio Bucky said was, it's true, if you have an MOU, it obligates the WPCA to raise their rates, but like you said, there's different levels of sophistication. I think we should spell out the obligation to potentially raise rates in whatever document we produce, because, for example, we saw these, they didn't really raise rates this year, and it was, I think, a lack of sophistication maybe that, because these projects are there, they know that we're gonna have to fund them, and I just don't know. I mean, we are, Mr. Walsh has talked about, and I think we agree, we're gonna have to build capacity to do modeling for them in-house. But I also think we should bullet point out sort of for the WPCA for the future, like almost a primer on how the finances work.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, and that's, no, agreed.
although we do have Michelle now, which is.
Well, and that's where I know I'm jumping ahead, but the concept of that long-term financial plan, and maybe I'm thinking of it too simplistically, but it's almost like a 10-year projection, if you will. And it's a model driven by a bunch of assumptions. So the debt service assumptions flow right from the capital plan. They flow from the capital plan and how that's going to split. And once you have that in there, you have to say, okay, I have all these expenses, including debt service. I've got some fund balance. I want to maintain it, increase it, decrease it, bleed it in, whatever. And that drives, how you think about rates over the long term. And I'm sure there's a desire, just like there is with us, to not have your rates, like this. I mean, the whole reason we do this planning is so that we don't have a bunch of volatility in our mill rate, right? No one likes that. And this, I think, facilitates you got your decision making in the same way, right?
Yeah, I think I've only been on WPCA for, 9 months, but I think that there was, with the transition, I think there's a question from that body also in terms of the role of the town in making some of the decisions about the WPCA and projects that move forward, and those that don't, and who ultimately is the decision maker. So I think an MOU is a very good idea, just so everybody is on the same page for planning purposes. In setting the rates this year, the 3% rate, we just followed similar to cost of inflation, inflation at that time. We debated going with the same rate of the operating budget, and that's where the commission basically settled. But there was still a question. There wasn't a capital plan that was approved in the spring, in part because there was a lack of understanding of what potentially would be funded by the town, if anything, the prioritizing of projects, because what might be a town priority may or may not be a WPCA priority, and how those decisions are made.
It's very iterative.
So and that's just my very limited experience up until this point. So I very much appreciate the forward thinking, trying to get everybody on the same page and, planning for the future for every project on that plan.
Jim?
Can I ask, what is the size of the WPCA fund balance currently, and if we do go to the fund?
17+ million.
So if we go to the sharing, isn't there gonna be a lot of people on the side of the town who say, okay, as far as I'm concerned, if we're paying any of this because you can't fund it yourself, you should have zero fund balance? Or, how much fund balance do they really need to feel safe or to have like their comfort zone?
I mean, we've modeled it out, and you pay now, pay later. That fund balance is pretty much going away with the projects through debts. You can do it either through debt service or direct payment for costs, and it probably makes sense. We believe to sort of stretch it out as long as we can, but it will be going down to you want to have a few million there probably. But the way the projects are looking at this point, over the next 10 years, that fund balance will be paid, will go away. From 17.2 or 3 to probably 3 or 4 million.
Yeah, that's when we talk about a long-term financial plan, one of the assumptions you want to embed in, just like town does, is is there a minimum fund balance level you don't want to go between? And I think what Mr. Gerber's saying is you can either take that fund balance and say, okay, 17 million, I'll put 15 million of it on a project instead of bonding, or I'll bond the projects and instead of having to raise rates, I'll keep my, over time, keep my rates a little lower and use that fund balance to cover the debt service over time. So that's gonna be, those will have to be decisions and assumptions that are made in any plan. I know that, and just, I don't wanna, I think Mr. Devanzo took a shot at something like this a couple years ago. It didn't really go anywhere because it was sort of informal, and I don't think that this should be the responsibility of of a volunteer commissioner. I think it needs to have support from the town, but it should be formalized, and and the commissioner should have input to say, gee, this shows, we'd have to raise rates by 5% every year. Is that, do we want that? Would we rather use fund balance? What does that look like, et cetera? So. Jim, did you have your hand up or?
As long as, I understand this, I don't know what the fund balance is scheduled to come down to, that it's some amount, because you could wake up tomorrow and something blow.
Right.
And, we've seen it happen. So as long as there's some amount in there to.
Like if you have another
properly
digester issue or something.
Yes, to do what we're supposed to, some pot of money, so that we're not having to dip into our fund balance or something, like do an emergency bond or something like that.
What's the revenue of the WPCA? Is it like?
It's like
About 10 million.
I thought 14, but
there's
10,
Frank.
okay.
No, it's not.
10 million?
It's 10, it was 10 million this past year.
10 million, okay. Yes, if you were to have the same policy as you had for the town, that would mean maintaining a fund balance of like 1 million. Seems kind of low to me, I would hope it would be maintained at like 2 or 3 million.
What can happen there? Yeah, you need more than that.
Yeah, you could blow through 1 million. Okay. Anything, so boy, you opened a can of worms, Phil, with the MOU thing. No, that actually, it was really helpful. I'm glad
That was Craig.
Craig, both of you, thank you. Yeah, no, that's helpful. Anything else that we should? Let me just, no.
I'm gonna wait on my comment until we get to I'm just worried about timing.
Okay. All right, so we can move on then. Thank you. Thank you. Well, please stick around if this is all interesting to you, but we can move on to item 7. So this was just to hear and consider if you've got anything, Mr. Gerber. So we talked back when we talked about kind of the objectives of the committee, we talked about, and we touched on this a little bit at the full Board of Finance, recommendations related to the town's borrowing policy, including recommended levels of planned capital spending and related service projections. So what this agenda item is supposed to relate to is the third objective for the committee, which is to look at the recommended threshold under 10% that the town would use for planning purposes in the capital plan. We didn't get any backup on that item, but have you guys done some work on that?
I've been refining my Excel or remembering my Excel skills the last few days. There's so many variables, but I do think it's logical to say it should not go above 9%, because there are easily some, with what we currently have in our schedule, which we all know is not going to be what actually flows through, but it's currently in the schedule. We can shift some things. We're going to have to shift some things around, and we can do that and get to the 9%. We're still going to have to strive to get under 9%. So I believe, but for other reasons, for budget reasons, but so I think 9's a reasonable threshold, considering 10 is the threshold and 9 gets you a cushion.
Just to take everyone's temperature on that. So this, 1% for kind of plan level contingency. Does anyone have a point of view, Mr. Curley?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I think everyone on this call and on our full board appreciates the need to allow for some cushion. I would feel better if there was some analysis to support the 1%, because maybe it's 1.5%, or maybe it's 0.75%. I do modeling work with Excel every day. It's been my job forever. I'd love to get a copy of this spreadsheet that's used to kind of roll that forward, and just in advance of our larger Board of Finance meeting on this in November. I'd like to spend a little time playing with that to understand if we run over a project by 20, 30, 40%, does that eat up the 1%? Do we need more than that? Or is that too conservative? And I think that's the type of analysis that we could do between now and then. And I'd love to raise my hand to volunteer to do it.
Sure. I mean, that's essentially, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
That's essentially I've been doing. Putting all these different spreadsheets together into one and breaking out the assumptions onto a page where you can play with them. But there are some really big assumptions, like, will you get any grants? If it will be 5 million of grants a year. I mean, they make a difference. Will you run over by 10% every year or 30%? And you can play around with them, and I'll send you what I have. And you can't really nail down the right one because there's too many pieces. But
yeah,
you get, like, what I've gotten a sense is that, especially the big one being the project that shall not be named, the big one, the school. Things are moved around a little bit. That's a big variable as well, and that you can easily get to under 9% or to 8.5%, but you're still making assumptions. So, and that for every decision you make and for every time you go over, if you go over by 30% or something, that's being amortized over, that difference is being amortized over 20 years. And you would then have to make adjustments as you go on the remainder of the schedule. So it's a fluid schedule, and every decision, every issue has a 20-year lifespan. So.
Right, and that you touched on something, Mr. Gerber, that I think is relevant to everybody as we evaluate this stuff. Like, to me, I want to find out, like, if we look back to the capital discussion that we had, and we saw that we were approaching 10% in 2031. We know that this debt service is cumulative, and it covers a long period of time. So it's almost like the equivalent of a cruise ship and trying to turn it around, right? Like, it's slow and it takes a long time, and you have to be careful. And if we're not careful, we could blow through that 10%, well in advance. And know that, for me, I think what's important is to try and figure out where the yellow light is. Is it 9% 3 years in advance, or do we still have enough room to kind of make some changes on those subsequent projects to keep us under? And that's the type of analysis I'm looking forward to getting into.
Yeah, can I just say two things? One, I would also like to understand, going from 10% to 9%, what does that mean in terms of bonding dollars every year? Like, what does that equate to in terms of how many projects have to be shifted or moved, based on your model A? I think the other point that you brought up, which is so critical, and Mr. Marsilio and I also had a conversation about this too, is the grants. Because that could not, especially when it comes to WPCA, we could be talking about a lot, especially if we put ourselves in a position to go after federal grants, perhaps. That could make a material difference if we were successful. That requires resources in our operating budget near term. Those things would take some time to settle in and put us in a position to do that, but those, that could have a material impact. I don't think it makes sense to model in an assumption on grants before we have a solid plan to do that or the capacity to go do that. But I think to Mr. Curley's point and your point of how much can change and how fluid this thing is, that is a really big one. The good thing about this process, though, I think it's been shining some light on the need to really look at this area, because I don't recall this. I mean, I recall, Ms. Former First Selectwoman Kupchak, advocated to bring on a part-time grant writer, I think her first or second year in office, which was fully supported by everyone. And that was good, but I think we're understanding now that given the magnitude of these projects, it's not just writing grants, it's grant compliance can be a job. I just remember, even with, maybe it was CARES Act, but, I think it was the CARES Act and not ARPA, but I think Connie Saxel was practically full-time putting together compliance documentation to support the money that we were spending and getting reimbursed for. So it was quite a big deal.
And the big dollars are the federal grants, and tell me if I'm wrong, but I think we've shied away from some of those because of the volumes of work behind those, or at least that's what my understanding is. And
Time too.
Well, the volume of work.
Yeah,
Do that.
Well,
why,
Who's gonna do these?
like really stringent, compliance,
But if we spend $150,000 to pay someone to do a grant to get the benefit of $1 million plus, like it'll pay for itself.
Yeah. I mean that we could go all in and hire a few, or we could do one at a time and see what the payback is. But right now we're just looking at a full-time grant writer with a strong skill set.
There's towns or cities or size or give or take that have a grant, entire department to deal with that.
I would think you'd have
Right? They have a whole grant shop because it's so much, but it pays for itself.
Yeah.
Right.
Probably
Well, I
left
don't
money on the table.
Just to get back to that 9%, you said you were taking a temperature there.
Mhm.
I mean, I think just overall, I worry about the amount of overages we're seeing in projects. And obviously, with everything we saw in the capital planning, it's, we were hitting the threshold, coming pretty close. I mean, I think that I think what you were getting at, Lori, to take that down, what do we need to reduce the number by, and what projects then we need to make some very tough decisions, or the administration has to make some tough decisions on what's gonna go, because there's no way that all of those projects can move forward without significantly increasing taxes. So we have to, look at that and see what that looks like.
Well, yeah, so your point is, and I think Mr. Gerber made the point, we're talking about 9%, 8%, like versus where we are now, that is a percentage increase on the mill rate, going from 6.5% to 9%. That's
a
a
lot.
direct increase. That's percentage of total expenditures. That flows right to the mill rate. So, I mean, these
Right
projects,
now, the current rate is what, 6?
it's shy of 7. What is it?
It's almost 7, right?
It's below 7.
A little bit under 7.
Yeah.
5, 6 is.
6.9 or something. It was,
Yeah.
I didn't bring the chart in front of me, and I was gonna steal hers if she had it.
Yeah,
I
23.
that's a huge number.
yeah, and I agreed.
And to take it in one, I mean, I don't know what the proposal would be. Obviously, there's a lot of thought that would go into it, but I don't know that you do that in 1 year.
No.
No, and I think we've said, I mean, capital, we put everything on, and I would note that we also increased the items, so some of that factor about going over has starting to, hopefully is gonna start to fade away. We were putting much more realistic escalators, we were putting contingency factors on.
40%
We were
standard.
doing that, but in some instances, we were doing 35% based upon, you know, whereas before they were plugging in, you know, the same number year after year or very similar, and we're going, wait a minute, there's certain things that we know off of, you know, manufacturing is exponentially greater, and we're putting those in, and we're gonna continue to try to refine those. And I think you also look at year one, where it was already, it goes all the way into the 50s, and we, you know, sort of said that was
$50 million of
$50 million
bonding.
of bonding. I'm not looking at, you know, from my position in this next July necessarily being quite, you know, at that level. But if you were to look at it today, based upon everything we have and all of the timelines, that's where we are. But just like last year, where we had presented in February and then I believe again in May, and then we went out in June and we really drilled down and said, who's actually gonna be able to utilize these dollars in this time frame? And if somebody can't in this time frame, we don't bond for it. And it does cascade outward and there's an effect, but it's being responsible and making sure that we're not then sitting on it and paying for, whether we're earning interest or not, which isn't gonna last forever. So, you know, we're trying to tighten up as much as we can there. And I would say the ability to pay for these things is the bigger thing, and at least in that, you know, 5-year ramp up window and keep the tax rate reasonable while doing that is almost a bigger deal than the you know, 7, 8, 9 or 10%. Because those numbers, you know, if inflation continues to be even relatively where we are, in theory, budget growth will be higher. We used a lower budget growth number, so that number might actually be lower if budget growth's higher. That doesn't matter if you can't do it in a reasonable way for the taxpayer.
Thank you. Ms. Vitale?
Just with some of the blight, I will name it, I think that we need to be cognizant of timelines at the state level for the potential for grants. Just going back to the HVAC, that we move that forward at a faster time line and ended up with being first in line for that first round of HVAC money. So just putting it out there that we don't leave money on the table in that respect.
Yep.
Because the answers about that grant money comes relatively quickly as opposed to some of these federal dollars.
Yep. Agreed. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of variables. One of the, you know, grants are a big thing. I think the other big uncertainty in here is all these escalators and contingency factors we've put in the plan. I think we're coming off a period of time where we feel a little burned based on authorizing projects that come in and double and triple the cost. And I think it's important to be cautious, and it's also important to recognize that we've just lived through you know, an extraordinary few years where we had a pandemic, we had significant supply chain disruptions, we had trillions of dollars of federal stimulus in the system, juicing up demand and raising costs. And that isn't going to last forever. And none of us really know. You know, we may not, you know, to your point, Mr. Becker, you know, inflation, if it stays settled down a little bit, there's a lot of guesses in here, but that's the point of a plan. You know, I think that there are certain things we can't control, but what we can control, or what we can strive to do is have the best planning process possible so that we're, you know, when things are changing, they're factors that were out of our control or we couldn't have known about, not the fact that we didn't have a thorough process and think about the right things, so. Okay, any other, Mr. Walsh?
I agree with Mr. Curl. I'd like to see the modeling of it. I mean, I'm probably a little more conservative, but I don't also wanna not do the project. So, while I might be a person who might wanna be at 8.5, I wanna see what it's gonna be, the 9, to make sure it's gonna cover it. I'm just afraid of projects coming up just out of the blue that we don't even know about.
Yeah.
I mean, we're just modeling out for things we want to do, not things we need to do. So, but I'd be willing to take a look at Mr. Curley's model and First Selectman's model, their Excel spreadsheets, and then to take a look at it at a later date.
Okay. Yes.
When you mentioned projects, the list we had, I saw is kind of like a giant wish list of anything we wanted to do or needed to do, that we thought we would need to do. When you're saying other projects, are you talking about, I mean, are we aware of anything that's not on the list? Or are we talking about stuff that's gonna come as a result of a storm? Something breaks? Cause I thought it was kind of a pretty intense list of the wants, the needs, the forecasted things that we might have.
Things always pop up, so I think that's really what we're talking about.
There's
Things always arise,
And
yeah,
something happens.
yeah, so this is just what we know.
Got it.
Yeah, I think if you look at the projection, and I'm gonna put the Board of Ed aside for a moment. Is that, the capital plan exploded to $300 million this year. I mean, it more than doubled, I think, from last year, if I recall. I don't know, but if you look at the town, you have all this stuff and then it falls off. I don't think anyone believes that, years 6 to 10, we're not gonna do anything. It's just that we haven't identified those things yet. And as these more things will come up every year that will be scheduled out.
Yeah, and I was even thinking more the next 3 years. I wasn't even thinking that far out.
Yeah, I guess
But there's nothing aware, I guess my question is, there's nothing aware that we're not putting on the list because there's things that we'd like to have versus need to have.
That's the question for. You're not hiding anything.
No, I mean, we have huge resiliency issues downtown that we're not even we haven't really quite got a handle on. So I don't know, maybe I can punt this over to John, for making downtown truly resilient, we've kind of pushed that.
So we've identified.
Well, we know it's a problem, but we haven't really
that's on here, but it got pushed out to the 35 because it was deemed at 30 million.
You just never.
Our dollars near term.
There's no definition around.
This is for flooding, right?
Yeah.
This is more for the flooding stuff,
under the
title stuff.
Yeah.
We have an RFP out now for addressing flooding entirely in the town. So obviously those are things that when that comes back, there's gonna be a matrix and then we're gonna have to decide from there what may get loaded in. Those are things that couldn't tell you what those projects may or may not even be, but at some stage they come in. At the same rate, a lot of this.
So you're saying under the umbrella of resilience, there's
that as well, but those aren't projects that we added or didn't put on.
Just don't know.
They're not even there yet. And though I think that we anticipate largely projects like that are ones we're gonna seek a lot of grant dollars for ultimately, because those have a tendency to be more substantial and more federal or state federal pass through grant type projects. There's timeline changes in here. A lot of this is front loaded. We were working towards the capital plan timeline and trying to get things on, and a lot of dates. Everyone wants everything now, even when it's a need. The want part is the timeline a lot of times. I would argue that most of the things that are on here are needs, and really everything is in some fashion. There's questions about timelines. So somebody in 2028 with a cash flow of 29 and 30, well, now we start to say, well, wait a minute, you want it in that, but we can move it 2 years further and we can stretch out the cash flow, and that makes an impact. And in this particular project, it doesn't cause a series of issues. Bless you. One of the problems is some of the projects, if you do that, it just becomes ever growing costs. And so we're trying to analyze that. So I think we intend, no matter what, to be informed by the work of this committee and the board, but then when we come back for dollars in that early, and winter, like January to March, somewhere in there, to then go out for a lot of the bigger projects for next year. The capital plan probably will look different, but it will also have several more months of working with all the departments and the stakeholders to try to see what we can do to stretch those things out effectively and be more realistic.
Okay. So that was, what's that?
200 million.
Okay. So 215 million?
15 million of debt.
Okay, that's how much debt we have us right now. Okay, so that was a good discussion on the temperature. I think there's a desire for more information, and Mr. Gerber's sharpening his spreadsheet skills and kind of work on that. Okay, so the next item, I think we've actually we've covered some of this, but item 8 is to hear and consider next steps and timelines, including, and this gets sort of the iterative part. Capital plan update is almost the last thing that comes out of all this. So capital plan update, which will be necessary to vote on major projects. The WPCA financial planning is an input to that, and other matters to be considered by the subcommittee. And I've got a couple of them now. One is the MOU whole process and kind of this, formalizing a policy with the MOU. But in terms of the capital, let me go to the middle one first. So WPCA financial planning. This gets back to the concept of having a long-term plan with including a thought process on how projects are financed between the town and the WPCA. It includes considerations of what fund balance should be and how it will be used over time. And the capital plan and the debt service feed into it, and it's got to make assumptions about rates and fees. So rates meaning just normal sewer bills, which are, I know are the bulk of the revenue, but also any fees that are charged for, using whatever. So working backwards, if we need to have a capital plan update by February, and the WPCA financial plan has to be a component of that. I just want to make sure we're being thoughtful and realistic about what this takes and who's going to work on it, and what does this timeline look like? I mean, obviously, any plan has to be developed, and it has to be, the commissioners have to, and management has to, approve it in some fashion. So, and we have urgency, I think, around a February timeframe to finish everything. So at least that was sort of my going in assumption. So I don't know, Mr. Gerber, in terms of planning, resources, what's your thought process on getting that rolling?
So we have Frank on the line, who has sort of indicated that he's willing to help with the financial analysis. I actually haven't
So you're gonna be the WPCA czar, is that it, or what?
I like that. If you guys could get me a nice fancy hat.
We'll buy you WPCs. But I have not had the discussion with Michelle yet. I think
Mike and I are meeting tomorrow.
oh, you are, yeah. That he told me you set that up.
Yeah, so Bill had mentioned Bill had mentioned this to me maybe, I don't know, a couple weeks ago. And I reached out to Michelle, and so we had set a meeting kind of before we formalized, or before I even know this was happening. So I think that's the starting point. There's certain data that we'd have to get from, that I'd be interested in, say from the tax collector, certain sewer usage and the rates, obviously. So I think it's good just to, Michelle and I are going to kind of talk about over some of the challenges, any questions that she has, and, get a starting point on, something more basic. And then, like you said, Lori, it comes down to the assumptions that you put in. So.
Okay. And maybe I'll ask board members for input, but I think maybe a good starting point on this financial plan is to have some alignment on what the endpoint should be. So, what do we want this thing to look like at the end of the day? I mean, I had sort of 10 years in my head, just because that aligns with the capital plan. But I had in mind, and again, anybody chime in, sort of a 10-year projection that would incorporate debt service numbers directly from the capital plan. Again, include a philosophy around fund balance, how much we need to keep, how much we're going to use, and for what, and make assumptions about rates and fees and obviously also normal operating expenses, additional personnel, you know, whatever it might be, right? So does anyone have a different view on that? Does 10 years sound right? Does that make
I
sense?
think 10 years, I mean,
Yeah.
10 years sounds right for the, you know, the thoughtful piece of it, but for the debt service, that, you know, for looking at percentages, you do need to carry it out
Right.
further. And so we need
We have
to,
a waterfall for the WPCA as well, a standalone waterfall, which
right.
I know Matt's given us before. So.
And we'd have to make I mean, I am assuming that we have kind of a bolus of projects, like a backlog. I mean, I don't think we're always going to be asking for this number of projects. I think John would agree that this is an unusual. I mean, I hear it from him all the time. Like, we got to get our act together. There's a lot of projects, and they're all sort of you know, a lot of them are urgent. We should get over a hump, and so it shouldn't be like really high forever. But we need to agree on a sort of steady state, inflated for inflation, and then, you know, otherwise we won't really see the potential impact on the ratios, debt service to budget.
And Frank, just in terms of putting this plan together with you know, the right kind of level of transparency and understanding for everyone, are you envisioning kind of a, you know, a P&L that looks like the budget with that level of detail, something less than that? Have you given that any thought?
Yeah, so I mean, this is something that I had started to work on, because this has come up a couple times in anticipation that we would need something like this. So, you know, basically what I had envisioned was revenue, expenses, some years of actual, so you could see how they're trending, going outward into time. So that's about your 10 years. And then, you know, just kind of breaking out either the capital projects, so you could kind of see the detail of what's flowing into here, having debt service schedules that feed into the model. So this is what I would say would be the starting point that I was thinking of. You know, when it comes to revenue, there's differing opinions, you know, whether you just include like the really big stuff, like for example, I mean, the really big stuff is sewer user fees and infiltration and inflow. The rest could really just be an all other column, right? So I may break these down and summarize them.
Sorry, why is I&I a revenue?
Yeah, it's a collection. We collect the fee, special fee for that.
Oh, we do?
Yeah, we collect.
But it's not enough.
Commercial.
Oh, for commercial, okay, got it, okay.
Yeah, so you know, it's more consumable if it's a little bit more summarized than having a lot of like each detailed line. A lot of people get lost in the weeds with that. So I would say breaking some of the big revenues into categories, breaking expenses into some manageable categories, and then projecting outwardly. So and documenting the assumptions. So that's the starting point that I'm envisioning.
Okay, sounds good. Any thoughts from the committee or the Board of Finance? Okay. All right. Okay, so that would be the financial plan, and then the capital plan update. Obviously, the WPCA is a component. The capital plan update also requires, obviously, revisiting together with the Board of Ed, the whole plan and how we get to the 9% or 8.5% or whatever that is. So is that process happening? Is it in, we don't have to get, that process has to happen, right? Okay. So I'll leave that up to you guys, but you know, the WPCA is only one input to this. It's a big one, but I think that's another one. Okay.
Just a question.
Yes.
So, we have tours coming this weekend, for the firehouses and Dwight. And I'm just curious, I know that I'm going, I'm excited to go.
I am as well.
And, what is the next steps after that? So we're going for the tours, but are we regrouping as a board or a committee, or I don't know how, like.
In the capital plan?
are they looking for feedback after we go over these tours, whether or not, how that impacts the capital plan?
No, so the plan, and we've gone back and forth on this numerous times, and I met with the superintendent for 2 hours yesterday. We had, as a board, compiled a number of questions.
Yes.
And asked for a bunch of data, specifically on the Dwight/ACC project.
Yes.
So what I committed to do and what I told the board at our last full Board of Finance meeting and the chairwoman of the Board of Ed and the superintendent was that as soon as that data was pulled together, that we would schedule a meeting, just whether possibly it fits into a regular meeting or a special meeting if necessary, to review that data. And what was requested by the board includes comparisons and analysis, fiscal analysis of a bunch of different things. So as soon as that is done, we will meet and then go from there.
Got it.
So that's the plan on that. And I just think that, the tour is helpful to just give color,
visual, et cetera.
Exactly, yes.
Did the superintendent give you any kind of timeline to get answers to your questions?
No. It's my belief that, they might need some help to do that. I know Silver Petroselli has done some analysis, but there's other analysis that, maybe there's the capacity for Angelus or someone to put together estimates, but, so I think, so that's in his court now.
But yeah, it is, the school portion's roughly half of the capital plan, so the timelines and whatnot is gonna be important. No matter what happens with that project in general, slotting in cash flows, timelines, what we can and can't do in various years. It was previously at the 12.5 million mark when we were half and half. It's now significantly more than half in theory. So it dominates what we can do, whether it's WPCA or downside. So, separate from Dwight, I mean, just in general, we need to be able to work through the time, the cash flow timeline.
Yeah, I think the projects. There were new the total waterfall grew from, I know it's roughly 300, I think it's roughly 300 million. Am I wrong about that? No, the Board of Ed piece.
The Board of Ed piece,
Am I?
The Board of Ed piece of
the Board of Ed project.
Yeah. Yeah, it was.
The Board of Ed piece right now is 240 million.
240 million? Okay.
And the town side is marked at 228, and then you've got the WPCA portion, so.
You were asking though year over year, right?
Well, and it's actually not 228, cause
You were looking for what it was last year versus this year,
Yeah,
right? Not just
it was-
comparative.
Yeah, no, yeah, so it's 240 million this year. Last year, because I think some stuff got accelerated, so I don't remember, but I think it's, and some of that too is.
on the town side's 140.
Adjusting the
If you
estimate.
take the 2035 out, which is not actual, none of that is, like, those are all what we think we're gonna go out for grants or the wish list, that's not, so if you take that out, it's 141 million. So.
So yeah,
Is the Board of Ed number before grants or after grants?
The Board of Ed number is.
To that point of what?
The Board of Ed number is actually.
Reimbursements,
Yeah, that's supposed to be net of, because
That's net.
we're looking at the actual cash flow.
maybe the 300 on million thing on.
I think if you added that, if you were 300 on project size,
300 on project, yeah, 240.
That's grants for Dwight.
So it's,
because
the reimbursement.
Reimbursement, I think it's
I call it,
it's like 18.
we're talking actual net bonded numbers in the summary pages.
and then the WPCA, so of the total is, so WPCA is 117 million. I'm looking at this right. The Board of Ed 240.
the main point is it dominates the,
Yeah, I mean,
dominates our
in
body.
order to get to a
So,
capital plan and
just-
get into whatever percentage you are going to recommend, obviously that has to be a process of, And I think that, just in reflecting, the process that we had, in the prior administration was a concept around defining a total dollar amount and splitting it up. And it was, you get this much, you get this much, you get this much, work within your budget. And I think, as I understand this process, it is different now. We are going to view priorities for the town as a whole. That's a little bit harder because it requires collaboration and discussion. But I believe that's the right thing to do because we should be looking at priorities for the town as a whole. And there may be years, part of the challenge with the old process was that there was never going to be enough money for a Dwight school, for example. And in some cases, if you expend an allocation in other areas, you're not going to have the necessary funds to do an urgent project in another area. So that collaboration needs to happen. So that's part of the timeline. I don't know what that timeline is, but that's a to-do, along with the financial plan for the WPCA. All of those things are in place. Okay. All right. Anything else? Okay, so item 9, I'm going to suggest that we, since we decided to sort of formalize this committee with the Board of Finance first, why don't we talk about the timing? We don't necessarily have to vote on it right now. But the proposed meeting schedule kind of for the committee kind of aligns with what we said before. And it's the meeting schedule that was proposed here is working backwards from February. So I think, as we all know, the Board of Finance gets absorbed in the annual budget process in March. So we typically aim to consider and approve capital projects before the budget process begins in earnest. So working from the bottom, the idea would be that by February, the committee makes recommendations to the Board of Finance based on, the objectives that were discussed earlier. And a revised capital plan would be completed at that point to guide individual project approval discussions. So to get there, the proposed schedule for this committee is monthly meetings. What's in the back, it says potential agenda items. This was just an attempt to put a thought process around what would have to happen in these meetings to back into what we need. So, by next month, to act upon, let's see. So I guess we would have to, maybe we'll have to, we're not going to vote on this. So maybe we can revisit this date and shift it out so it's after the Board of Finance meeting. But I think we want to act on recommendations, if any, for the fund balance policy. There may be none. Act on recommendations for the debt service policy. There may be none. I don't think doesn't seem like there's an appetite to move off 10%. Act upon recommendations, if available at the time, for this 9% or 8.5% recommendation that comes from the administration and the treatment of the WPCA debt. That might be a little optimistic, but in any event, a November meeting. By December, act upon a recommended methodology for financing WPCA projects. That would mean splitting an MOA, and review the first shot of the WPCA financial plan. I think that needs to be done because if it's going to be folded into the capital plan, it needs to have something to put in. And then by January, for the committee to review the updated capital plan and figure out where we are. And then for February to bring forth whatever recommendations arise to the full Board of Finance and review the capital plan with the full Board of Finance, again, enabling us to be able to vote on projects in February. So all these things might not exactly be right in terms of potential agendas, but what you see here is just monthly meetings for the next 3 months. So again, since we decided at the beginning of this meeting to formalize the committee with the Board of Finance, maybe we don't ask for a vote on this right now, and maybe we shift that November 6th date until after the Board of Finance Committee, but does that feel right? 3 meetings, for here, okay. Okay,
Just a question, when
Yes.
is our board meeting, I don't have my calendar in front of me, when is our board meeting? Our normal board meeting that we're gonna talk about the the objective of this committee.
the 6th. So the reason the 6th is here
Okay,
for
so it's
committee
on-
meeting, normally, this is what we do with audit committee meetings, we have it in
Yeah.
advance of.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, so we probably wouldn't do the 6th, we'd have the Board of Finance meeting and do
Pick
it,
a new date,
yeah, in November, but I think in November,
we definitely have to have a date.
yes, November, December, January.
Okay, I agree with you.
All right. Anything else, before we wrap up? Well, I wanna thank, our new and old board members for coming and, participating, and thank the administration, WPCA leadership, for being here. And I'll make a motion to adjourn.
I'll second that.
All right, we're adjourned. Thanks, everybody.